how do we get basically from two of every kind that was on the ark, just a few thousand years ago, and how do we go from those two of every kind to thousands and thousands of species that we see today?
Well, g'day,
Yeah,
it's
sure.
Ken Colson here from Creation Unfolding, and today I have Jake Ramgren with me from the New Creation blog. So that's kind of a new blog that's just sort of started going, so maybe Jake can tell us a bit about it. So Jake, just a little bit about yourself, where you live, what you're doing, and a little bit about New Creation blog.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I reside in Springfield, Massachusetts, where there's not a lot of creationism going on. I can tell you that. So I'm involved with the New Creation blog, like you said. We try and publish, at least an article every week. Every Wednesday, we publish an article, kind of taking something in the scientific sphere of creationism, something a scientist has been working on, and we present it, summarize it, put out an article on kind of different current issues, pieces of evidence, kind of data like that. My background is in zoology. I went and got my bachelor's degree in zoology down in Jackson, Tennessee, at a school called Union University. So I have the bachelor's in zoology, came back here to Massachusetts, and ended up teaching science for a couple of years. And now I'll be involved in a couple of projects coming up, actually in the field of conservation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I'm going to get involved working for Connecticut State Parks in their conservation department, and also staying involved with some creation projects, both that I'm working on here and things through the New Creation blog and stuff like that. So always got one foot in creationism, but that's where my background is zoology, and that's what I like to talk about, and that's what I'm going to talk about today.
Great, fantastic. Now, for people who want to find the New Creation blog, what is the address for it?
Yeah, very easy. Just type in newcreation.blog.
Okay, that's as easy as that. Great. And they got
Yep,
tons of great articles on there. I've got some articles on there as well.
that's right,
So
you do.
good resources. So, Jake, what are we looking at today?
Well, today I wanted to share a presentation that I gave at Origins conference this year, on something called contemporary evolution, and this is something that is going to be somewhat related to the field of conservation. So if I can pull that up here. Okay, here we go. So what I talked about was contemporary evolution, and so I'm applying this concept to what we call post-flood speciation models. Post-flood speciation model is something creationists are working on for quite a while now, which is coming towards the question of, we're coming at the question, how do we get basically from two of every kind that was on the ark, just a few thousand years ago, and how do we go from those two of every kind to thousands and thousands of species that we see today? That's, in my view, that's one of the biggest questions, if not the biggest question in creation biology, is how do we get there? And so there's a lot of zoology involved in that. That's kind of how I got involved with this idea. It was fascinating to me, the idea that we have to answer a question like this. And so about a little over a year ago, a year and a couple months now, I decided to try and tackle this. I gave my first talk, I gave first presentation on Origins that was about something else last year, and just got that kind of experience on my belt. And I was like, all right, now I want to help out and tackle this question. So what is contemporary evolution? To explain this, basically, we're talking about how speciation works, right? Contemporary evolution is going to be helping us explain how we get from one species to two species, and then obviously we need from that created kind on the ark to, sometimes dozens of species, lots of species that are within that same created kind. So how does this happen? This is kind of the very Darwinian explanation of this. This is what Darwin observed. We can now graph it. So this is from Trends in Ecology and Evolution. And what you see here, again, completely borrowed graph here. It's just super simple. This isn't based on actual data. This is just a representation of what's going on. So these bell-shaped curves are very perfect. These bell-shaped curves represent values that are basically, they're functions. So if you see where the letter A is for the first bell-shaped curve, that says original fitness function. And then there's one that says original trait distribution. So what's going on there is that the original fitness function is basically a range of, say, a trait. So what I have there is beak size. You can see my picture of a couple of Darwin's finches.
Yeah.
And they're going to vary in beak size. So the original fitness function is just the range of all the different sizes that the beaks can have. Down here are kind of the fringes, right? So there's not a lot of birds that have a beak that is this small, and there are not a lot of birds that have a beak that are this big.
Yeah.
All right, there's a range of beak sizes. For this top curve, that's the range of sizes that can live in that environment. All right, that's the fitness level. So the perfect fitness is right here in the middle, which is the average, beak size. Right in the middle is exactly where you want to be if you're a finch. That's the exact bill size that is perfect for breaking open seeds that you want without being so big that it's too heavy for you or uses up too much energy and all sorts of things. So that's where you want to be right here. And then there's some that are bigger and some that are small. This original trait distribution is what the finch species actually has. So if the top one is what beak sizes can operate in the area, the smaller one is this is what the actual population has.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes in nature, conditions change or your population moves to a new area. So if you're on one island, some of the birds actually move on to another island. So this is the range that the bird originally had, but this new island that has moved to has a new fitness function.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so that one says that these seeds are a little bit bigger, they're a little tougher to crack. And so we need birds that have a bigger beak size.
Yeah. So it's important, I think, for the audience to see that in that bottom one there, the actual beak size didn't change. What changed was the environmental
Yes.
factors, right? So that's what that big bell curve is. That's the fitness function for that particular ecological place on that island.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So that's exactly this is what the ecological that's what the niche is warranted, right? The niche is like an organism's role in the ecosystem. So that's what it is, and then this is what the bird actually has. So once this happens, you have a new fitness function. The population you have originally right here with this little Greek symbol looks like a Z. This is the trait value it had. Well, it's going to change because it needs to fit this. So all the beak sizes that are too small, right? The average is now a little bit too small.
Mm.
All right. And then all the birds that had below average beaks already, they're not going to make it on this new island. And they're going to, if they do try and live on that island, they're going to starve.
Right.
And so those ones are going to get eliminated. And the ones that are fit right here, where there's a crossover of the beaks that were already on the larger end, those ones are going to survive. And then when they reproduce, they're going to introduce a new type of population, all of which has larger beak size. And so there's an evolutionary trajectory here of the population changing. And so what happens is if there's an old island that looks like this, and there's a new island that looks like this, when the finch species colonizes that new island, it eventually grows so different to accommodate the new conditions that it becomes a new species.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically natural selection, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Natural selection. So with this process where the ones that are right here that are on the outside of the new curve, those are the weak. Those are the ones that do not have high fitness, and those get killed off. And the ones that do have high fitness are going to live on and reproduce. So it's exactly what Darwin observed. This is just Darwin's theory kind of graphed out for us. So that's how you get a new species.
Right. I like that. I like that bell curve model you've got there. It's a good way of explaining it.
Yeah, very easy, very easy. And so that's what's going to help us kind of understand what we're looking at from here on out. So. Okay. So that's the fitness function, and then the original trait value. The trait value changes to fit the fitness function. All right, so what is contemporary evolution? This term I keep using. And so now I kind of want to switch gears a little bit. Now that we have that under our belts, I wanted to talk about one of the biggest critiques that is thrown at creationists, specifically in the area of biology, where you have evolutionary biologists, ecologists, even paleontologists. When they look at creation biologists and we look crazy to them, because their biggest critique against us is that we believe in something that they call hyperevolution, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, right? They say, oh, they believe in hyperevolution. Ken Ham gets this thrown at him all the time because on his arc, he has two of every kind, and they say, well, you have to believe that those kinds turn into so many species in such a short amount of time, just a few thousand years. You believe in hyperevolution. You believe in way too much evolution in way too short a period of time.
Right.
So again, we even call it this, but they call it post-flood rapid speciation, right? It has to be really, really quick.
Yeah.
I've even seen them call it accelerated evolution, right? And so this is a critique that is thrown at, that we believe in too much evolution because of this. And even I hosted a creation conference here in Massachusetts, got a few speakers out, and Stephen Lloyd made it out here. from Biblical Creation Trust in England. And when he came, he was talking about this idea of where creationism needs to go. And he put it this way, and I thought it was good, so I put it in here. He said we need to out evolution the evolutionists because we believe in so much change in such a short amount of time.
Right.
So this idea was very much on my mind while I
It's
was.
kind of interesting because recently in creationist circles, this has been a critique against a group of creationists, right?
Yeah.
So there's been a disparaging term called young age evolutionists that's been thrown at a particular group of creationists because because we're sort of talking about this contemporary evolution. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I saw some of those works that were put out, kind of accusing people of that. And again, it's I think the people who were accused of that, they weren't necessarily mad at the accusation of being young Earth evolutionists. It was more so that the creation model already includes so much quick evolution that I feel like the response was almost like, yeah, we kind of are, but like, aren't you as well? Like, what creationist doesn't believe that two of every kind on the ark became all of these species? Like, if I'm a young Earth evolutionist, so are you. So
yeah,
in my opinion, I think that was kind of the frustrating part of that. So,
yeah,
so this is something that's been hurled at creationists for a little while now. What I'm pointing out here is that contemporary evolution is not something that creationists came up with. Right? Contemporary evolution is something that was really first found out. There's some in evolutionary biology papers, but it was really discovered by conservationists. It was people who are working hands-on with wildlife, trying to protect and preserve it. And they were noticing that these animals they're working with were producing new traits, right? They're evolving new traits in such a short amount of time that they realized they needed to kind of incorporate that into their own conservation techniques. So before, when evolution could only happen over millions of years, new traits wouldn't form. Darwin's idea is that you wouldn't get a new species for quite some time. A conservationist doesn't care what the species is going to look like in 100,000 years from now or a million years from now, because they're trying to save the species now. So they only care about what it's going to look like for the next few decades because they want to save it. That's the timeline they're working on. So evolution and conservation were for a long time completely different camps. And now the conservationists are starting to notice there's something happening here where we're getting this hyper-evolution. We're getting this accelerated evolution. We're seeing it in real time. And that's what contemporary evolution is. It's the evolution of traits in just years or decades.
And so this is a term that's actually used in the secular literature.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where I got it. I didn't come up with this from my research. It was, I went on to Google Scholar, right? I mean, it's like almost a lazy way to research, but I'm just Googling keywords and I'm saying, look, if we're right, if creationists are right, and things are happening much faster than the evolutionist thinks they're happening, we should start to see that in the literature, right? We should start to see them noticing it. And I have some fun quotes on that a little bit later. I'll show some of these articles that I'm looking at.
Sure.
But basically, here's why contemporary evolution matters for the conventional scientist, for people who are just looking at this from the evolutionary perspective. To them, contemporary evolution it's pretty exciting because it's showing adaptation and evolution in action. So for them, it's like, look at this. It's like millions of years of evolution. It's happening right before our eyes.
Right.
So very exciting for them. So they're not going to they're not going to dodge it or ignore it. It's pretty exciting for them. And then, like I said, for conservationists, it's extremely relevant for planning what you're going to do in the next few decades. If your population is evolving larger beaks, like the Darwin's finch was, that's something you need to keep in mind if you're trying to save that population.
Yeah.
That's just kind of an example off the top of my head, but this is, and even when evolutionists take a look at this, the evolutionary biologists, there are public papers published where they're saying, hey, conservationists, hey, ecologists, like this is happening. Please pay attention to this so you can help save these species, right? They're kind of ringing a bell almost and saying, take a look at what we're seeing here. But for creationists, of course, and here's where I'm going to use it, where I'm taking this, is of course for young Earth creationists, this might help us shed some light on how we get that hyperevolution that we need. This is going to help us get from the ark to today in 4,500 years, right? We expected something like this to come up. So it's relevant to kind of everybody, right? Conservationists who don't really care about evolution but are trying to save a species, evolutionists who are trying to study evolution, creationists who are trying to study creation, right? It's relevant to everybody.
Yep.
So create contemporary evolution. My first point about it, really, now that we dive into talking about it, like where do we see it? What is it? My first point is, it definitely exists, right? It's observed. Since it's happening so quickly, right? One of the creationist critiques against evolution is like, oh, it takes so long, it's never going to be observable, right? Have you ever seen, this animal produce a different kind of animal?
Yeah.
And the evolutionist says, well, no, it takes too much time. Well, here, this is a different process. This is something we can actually see happening.
Yeah.
So here's a conservation paper. This is from, this article is titled Rapid Adaptation and Conservation. And it's from the journal is Conservation Biology. So volume 18, these authors, there's two of them. They say recent work has demonstrated that adaptive evolution often occurs on contemporary time scales. And they even say, what does contemporary time scale mean? Years to decades. Mm-hmm. This makes it of particular relevance to conservation planning. Reports of rapid evolution span a variety of species, traits, and situations, suggesting that rapid adaptation is the norm rather than the exception. Mm-hmm. So everything I just did with the bell-shaped curves in the original population with the evolutionary trajectory, in Darwin's book, he's thinking this is going to take a long time for the unfit ones to die off, for the fit ones to reproduce. It's going to take lots and lots of generations to really get that new species, that new population that you're looking for.
Yeah. Darwin was talking hundreds of thousands to millions of years for a species.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what most evolutionists back in the 19th century believed.
Yep, and so this article is kind of flying in the face of that. Not that they're saying it doesn't happen over millions of years,
right?
But they're just saying, hey, look, this happens much faster than we've been thinking it does, and so it just gets more exciting from there, right? If you're someone who is a creationist and you're expecting something like this to happen, as I'm searching and finding these articles, this is from 2004. As I'm finding these papers, it just gets more exciting from here. So here's one from Trends in Ecology and Evolution. So a little bit mixed there. Ecology is short time span, so this is a good article for this to be in, or a good journal. And this says contemporary evolution meets conservation biology. So evolution, conservation, we're throwing them together. This one says a common historical perception was that contemporary evolution has relatively few examples and was atypical. However, once biologists started to measure the strength of natural selection in the wild, they found that it was often stronger than expected. Once again, contemporary evolution is quite common. So this is the normal. This is everywhere. It's common. This is not a rare thing. Mm-hmm. Here we go. We challenge conservation biologists to consider evolution in the short term rather than just the long term. This is especially important given that evolution can occur within timeframes that are relevant to most conservation plans. Mm. So again, it's all more the same. It is conservation. You need to pay attention to this because it's happening so fast, right? It's happening in years to decades. Mm-hmm. This is my favorite one from Functional Ecology. And this says rapid evolution from genes to communities and back again. This one says planning to study slow evolution, we wound up studying rapid evolution instead. And we were not alone. Their postdoc even asked, if rapid evolution is so important in general, why didn't many other people see it before in their predator-prey experiments? It turns out that it had been seen, but not recognized. All right, so it's been in the literature it's been happening all this time, but because they were so committed, or maybe not even realizing it, they had assumed that this process had to take so long. No one was actually looking for this because in their own model, they didn't need it to happen that quickly. Right. Again, if everybody were creationists, they might have predicted this. They might have been looking for it from the beginning, but they just weren't looking for it.
Yeah, that's a good point you make about predictions. So we would be predicting this, and I anticipate as the next decades go by that our predictions are going to be coming to fruition.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how this goes, and I plan to keep an eye on some of the literature here, and just see how many more examples can we get, right? And definitely see how the creation models kind of age over time, and we might have to change our model some as more and more of this comes out. Like this is a particularly new thing.
Yeah.
But this same article goes on to say that ecologists now recognize that ecologically important traits sometimes undergo large heritable changes on the same timescale as ecological change, and they even term it rapid or contemporary evolution. When conditions change, traits evolve, right? It's that quickly. Conditions change and a trait evolves immediately. It's not this long, slow process. that Darwin envisioned. Here's another one. I have this one in front of me right now on paper. I printed this out for the talk, so let's kind of reading over this again. This is a great paper from Scientific Reports that says adaptive radiation often gives rise to many species in short period of time. Then they say the mechanisms of this speciation is not well understood, but we know it's happening because we can see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
And this one's really, really cool to see them do this. So they even looked at this from a phylogenetic standpoint, which is, of course, looking at things from how closely are species related, and they can even reason backwards through genetics to find out how far in the past these two things diverged. So through phylogenetics, they look at the genetics between a whale and a human and a chimpanzee, and they say, well, the chimpanzee and the human split rather recently, but the whale split from the human, way back in the past because they're less genetically related. So they looked at this phylogenetically, and they said that recent phylogenetic analyses have further complicated this issue. These analyses have found phylogenetic patterns of multi-branching, the most extreme form of rapid radiation, in a wide variety of taxa. And this is the important part. In these cases, the interval between successive speciation events is too short to be statistically distinguishable from zero.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. So from the genetic standpoint, this has happened instantly, and you can't even observe it looking at it through the phylogenetic lens because it happens so fast. It's like one species to two species, and there's no room in between.
Mm-hmm. Which again is interesting because this is what Gould was talking about, right? With the fossil record, where you would just go from one organism to another organism in a geologically instant time period.
Yeah. I've just been looking into that for a future new creation article, even just reading up on Stephen Jay Gould stuff. And I think creationists were pretty excited about some of his ideas because they seem to fit pretty well in with what happened after the flood, with everything, with so much speciation happening.
Right.
So here's another interesting thing is that, since we didn't know this was happening, right? I mean, again, it was predicted by some, but people did not know that this was happening so quickly. And so mechanisms for these, as the paper I just cited, mechanisms are pretty mysterious as to what actually caused them. Because Darwin's mechanism, like I keep saying, natural selection, happens pretty slowly, right? It takes a while for the small beaks to be removed by a population, and then large beaks to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And that whole process kind of takes a little while. So scientists generally think that there's some mechanisms here besides natural selection that we just don't know about that's causing this to happen really quickly.
Yeah. Just to clarify that, right? So what you're saying is that realistically, scientists still don't know what the mechanisms are, all the mechanisms involved in this rapid evolution.
Yeah. And what I've told people before is, because again, that's another critique even that, from some evolution-minded people, who are saying, well, look, that, you don't have a mechanism to get from the ark to today. Like this whole process, you don't know what it is. Well, at least now we can say, at least we know it's happening, and it's happening, right? Everybody knows it's happening. And so there has to be a mechanism, even if we don't know what it is, there has to be a mechanism because we see it happening, right? So now that we can agree that this is happening pretty quickly, then it becomes less of an attack on creationists and just hey, we need to figure out an answer to this question, right? Everybody does. Even the evolutionists who are super excited because they're seeing evolution in action, they're starting to scratch their heads and say, hey, what if it's because of this? Or what if it's because of this? And we'll talk about a couple of those. But here, just showing here that that underlying rapid adaptive radiation remains poorly understood, right? These mechanisms we don't know. Mm-hmm. Despite a long history of research, we don't know how this is happening. Here's another one saying essentially the same thing. There's a major challenge when incorporating evolutionary theory into recovery programs because we don't know what the interactions are among selection, what gene flow, what demography, what do all these things have to do in this scenario? What are the effects that they have? We're not sure. We don't know what these mechanisms are.
Right.
And so, of course, since creationists have been thinking along these lines for a little while, there have been a couple of mechanisms that have been proposed, and there's been more coming out more recently. But traditionally, this is back in 2017. Founder effects, this is a term used by conservationists, ecologists, evolutionary biologists Founder events are basically where you have an original population and a small group within that population leaves and founds its own kind of population. And so the conditions that they're in, it's kind of like the finch idea. You have a population of finches on an island, and then a few move on to this next island. So it's not a superpower that can create anything, but it's kind of a mechanism that helps with diversification. And Gene Leitner and John Alquist proposed that this was something that was very important after the flood, that as populations moved around, a tiny group in that population would split off, and then another tiny group would split off. And kind of as you go along, all these different founder effects are helping cause these quick speciation events.
Mm-hmm.
And then this has been a very popular one that's kind of been vaguely defined, in my opinion. I think creationists need to pin this down, but we can certainly say this to be true at this point, in that we believe that God created in his kinds just the genetic potential or the ability to diversify already. So a lot of the genetic traits that are popping up that are new, we believe a lot of those were already programmed into the creature. They just weren't being expressed until they were needed. So large beaks weren't expressed until, hey, come to find out, you need a larger beak. And so there's genetic information already there to utilize, and it starts to be expressed later on. So there's kind of this vague mechanism of when God says to fill the earth, multiply, he even says it to the animals, right? Spread across the world. We can also mean that to be not just spread and reproduce, but also adapt to new environments you come across. And if God's asking these animals to adapt, he probably designed in them the ability to do that, right? He's not going to ask them to do something they physically cannot do.
Right.
So you were reading into that a little bit, but it makes a lot of sense to say when populations are spreading across the globe, there's genetic potential in there to say, oh, I found, I run into a cave system. That's cool. I can lose my eyes really quickly and develop new functions on my mouth that help me sense my environment by sensing little changes in pressure in the water and things like that.
Right.
And so there are things like that can, I'm sure you've heard of these things before. There's kind of this mechanism that every creature has the ability to adapt to new things that it finds.
Yeah, Todd Wood, he defined a term called mediated design, which would be good to apply to that. So you have the original design during a creation week, and then you have God's mediated design, which is something that's occurring all the time as organisms adapt.
Yep, and of course, Institute for Creation Research is doing a lot of work in kind of that area with their environmental tracking idea.
Yeah.
Which there's a lot of cool stuff in there about animals that are tracking their environment, and then when the environment changes, they're quickly adapting to that change kind of internally. So that's been an idea in creationist literature for a little while now too. So those are kind of just a couple of examples of ways that creationists have proposed this rapid adaptation can happen. But even if we don't define the mechanisms, here's kind of, again, my presentation is a survey, right? So I'm just going over what we know, pulling things out from all different places. And basically my research question for myself was, can we make a case that there was rapid speciation happening after the flood without even, staking our claim in one of these mechanisms, right? Can we at least establish that rapid speciation probably happened so that we're not taking as many hits from the evolutionists saying, this doesn't happen, this is crazy, this is too much speciation happening in a short amount of time. Can we make a case for it, even if we haven't quite nailed down what these mechanisms are, just based on what we know today? So that was my research question. And so for the rest of this, it's kind of making the case for rapid speciation using this concept of contemporary evolution. And so this first part is something that's a little bit related to contemporary evolution, but it's not the same thing. So another concept to introduce called adaptive radiation. The word radiation has come up already in some of the papers that I was kind of rattling off there. But adaptive radiation is the proliferation of species from a single ancestor and diversification into many ecologically different forms. So the best example they have here is, they give 4 examples of this, but the best one is this first one right here, where you have the mainland of Africa, and a bird moves from the mainland to the island of Madagascar. Now, island of Madagascar has a variety of different flora, fauna, ecosystems available to it. Different elevations, forests, beaches, everything. And so when this bird lands, it's going to quickly diversify into four different forms, all right, a bunch of different forms to kind of fill those roles that it finds that are not filled. And so
Right.
they can have one where a beak is really long and curved. They can have one where the beak is short and pointy. They can have this, a beak that looks like this, and a beak that looks very tiny, and they all come from the same ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
And in this example, we even have four different genera here. Again, this is from an evolutionary perspective here. So they believe, anything can evolve to any degree.
Right.
But this is interesting, right? We keep in mind that adaptive radiation can occur, causing not just different species, but different genera even.
Right.
And so what you see here, why they split into A, B, C, and D is because even back in the 1950s, so the paper by Simpson here, he established four kind of causes of adaptive radiations. He's like, there are four things that can actually kickstart it. We have the origin of newly available resources. We have the invasion of a novel landmass. We have an extinction of predators or competitors, and we have the evolution of a key innovation. So they're all pictured right here.
Mm-hmm.
We have the colonization right here that I just described of a bird landing on Madagascar. The extinction event, which in their paradigm is going to evolve. The best example is a meteorite, that wiped out the dinosaurs. The asteroid that hit wiped out all the dinosaurs, and then the mammals took over after that.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to cause a lot of adaptive radiation. The appearance of new resources is if tectonic plates form a new mountain. This new mountain range is a new resource, right? Different elevations. And so this plant species is going to fill that mountain range and become a bunch of different species.
Right.
To fill each of those roles. And then finally, if there's a mutation or some dramatic change in a species that gives it a new feature, that's going to also help it adapt pretty quickly and become multiple different species, because with a new feature, you can utilize new resources. My professor, Jeremy Bloschke, told me about one case he saw where the water striders, these insects that we see, run around on the water,
Mm-hmm.
there was a case where one of them had a mutation where it doubled a portion of their DNA, just duplicated it, and on their back legs, this new fan appeared, kind of just like a fan we use to, blow on ourselves.
Right.
This new fan appeared on their legs, and it helps them push upstream more, and they access new resources that were upstream. So something like that, where a new innovation pops up,
Right.
it helps them quickly. Now that they have new resources, they can adapt pretty quickly and become multiple different species.
Yep.
So these are four causes. Again, back in the 1950s, they were establishing these, and then 2012, 2016, this idea was revisited. We basically have these four driving forces for adaptive radiation.
Mm-hmm.
So my first step here in building this case for post-flood rapid speciation is, well, we already have kind of a case for it, because if our four causes are colonization of new land masses, extinction events, new resources, and key innovations, a lot of these things are pretty much fit right in with what we'd expect the world to be like if animals are getting off of the ark.
Mm-hmm.
We have an entire world that is a new land to colonize. All right, the continents have been shifted around. All right, they have a completely new landscape, new land to fill and colonize. In that process of colonization, there's going to be a lot of extinction events. All right, so even in creation models, extinction events are happening after the flood as animals diversify. All right, we have a lot of extinct things in the fossil record that would have been on the ark. They would have survived the flood and gone extinct sometime after the flood. So extinction events are happening like crazy as well.
Mm-hmm. So this will be happening. This will be happening not just because of the flood, but for hundreds of years after the flood, as things are coming back into equilibrium. You're going to have populations flourish, and then they just kind of get wiped out because some mountain collapses or some earthquake kills the whole population. So this would be something that would be happening for hundreds of years until you get to some point of equilibrium.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the ark has a bunch of animals on it that are not alive today, right? They went extinct sometime between the ark and now. We have lots of Cenozoic mammals, the dinosaurs, right? Most creationists think, almost all creationists would put the dinosaurs on the ark, and it's only after that these things went extinct. So lots of extinction events happening. That's a cause of adaptive radiation. appearance of new resources, right? New mountains have formed, which means plants have colonized them, become new resources. Obviously, that's going to be happening right after the flood. New plants are going to be popping up all over the place. And then as the animals come in to colonize, they're going to adapt quickly to access all these new resources that are right there in front of them, right? It's a kind of free for all. We kind of imagine as two of every kind leaves the ark. And then as I just described, key innovations is kind of an evolutionary idea. So some creationists might be wary of that. Like, oh, new features appearing. I thought everything's winding down. We don't believe like, new features appear. But you do see, and while, a lot of those things are accurate, we do see mutations causing something like that. And there might be some cases where we can actually incorporate key innovations into, maybe there were a lot of mutations happening after the flood. As things are diversifying, they're encountering new things. It's a completely different world. Who knows? Maybe there are more key innovations happening, like this one.
Or there could be other mechanisms that we don't know about, right? That are, I mean, there could be mutations, but there could be other mechanisms as well that we don't know anything about that were at work at that time, even from a naturalistic perspective, taking advantage of what was going on post flood, but sort of have been essentially turned off because we've reached this place of equilibrium where all these niches are now filled.
Yeah, exactly. And we can even look at things that we know are within the same kind. So creationists believe all dogs were in the same kind. Well, like the fennec fox in the desert has these giant ears, right, that help it, kind of get rid of heat so it's not overheating, collect water and things like that. So that would be like that's a key innovation as well. It's within the created kind, right? But that's a new innovation that say the gray wolf doesn't have because it's living in the Pacific Northwest here in the United States, or even the maned wolf. It's a wolf that has like a lion mane. That's an innovation as well. So we do believe there could be some key innovations that are popping up here that are letting species diversify really quickly. So all four of these, in my mind, are just a perfect fit for our post-flood model. And so the term adaptive radiation, we definitely should hang on to as creationists. We should definitely keep that in mind,
Yeah.
because that's something that we should, it just fits too well in with the flood of Noah. And so now we can kind of head into, with that in mind, we can now kind of head into the actual survey portion, which is where are the examples that we're seeing this? All these articles are saying it's widespread. We see all these examples. It could be very, very common. Where are we seeing contemporary evolution today? So a little bit of a shifting gears from adaptive radiation, but I want us to keep adaptive radiation in mind because it's kind of the part one in our case for rapid speciation. So if part one is these are the things that cause speciation to happen and adaptive radiation to happen, part two is, do we see these divisions, these adaptations happening today in the time span that we would expect, right? And so part two is right here, is where do we see this in nature? And, this is confirming our suspicion that we're going to see quick adaptation and speciation events happening today. Now, most of these examples I'm giving you, some of these, there's no new species yet. No one's come along and named them as a new species, but I'll show you the way that they're diverging in really, really quick time spans to be very, very different in some of their traits. So we'll dive into that with this first example, which is this cute little bird here called the European blackcap. And this is a little bird that's over in Europe, and it's migratory. And what's happened here is this is borrowed right here from Current Biology. That's the journal this is from. The title is Contemporary Evolution of Reproductive Isolation and Phenotypic Divergence in Symmetry along a Migratory Divide. So long title there, but basically what this is saying is this blackcap is a migratory bird that one kind of population of blackcaps found a new migration route. Okay, so one of them is migrating kind of northwest, right here, and one of them migrates southwest. All right, and this is seasonal migrations. They fly when seasons change, and so you have southwest migrants and you have northwest migrants. And so what's happened here is both of these this new population that is split off and found a new migration route. One population here has to fly a lot longer. Okay, it's almost double what it looks like there, the migration route. So it's migrating for a longer period of time. It's to fly much longer. And then it's also encountering different diets, right? It's eating different types of seeds and insects. And so when they were observed, they took some birds from the one migration route, some birds from the other migration route, and they compared them, they found that in just a few generations, so tens of generations, these populations had a different wing size, they had a different beak shape, and they were varying somewhat in coloration, which is pretty significant. And that's the things those are the kind of things that get you a new species name, right? They say, oh, this has a new wing, this has a new beak, this has different coloration. Mm-hmm. This could be a new species, right? Someone could come in and name this a new species. It's a little tricky because everyone disagrees on what a species is. There's all these species definitions.
Right. I think that's interesting because, I mean, someone might come in and say, well, they reproduce with the original birds, so therefore it's not a new species. But that's just because we've defined it as reproduction. But what we're trying to show here is, significant changes in the organism.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up that, yes, there is hybridization between the two populations. What's funny about that is it's kind of sad, really. I got a chuckle out of the audience talking about this one, where when both populations, when there's interbreeding between them, the offspring of those two populations, they got lost in their migration, and they end up somewhere pretty close to directly in between both migration routes. So there's actually some instinct there of I'm going this way, and then the other bird is saying I'm going this way. But let's have some eggs first. They found a mate, they reproduced from both populations. Then those offspring, when they grew up, they didn't know where to go, and they migrated kind of in the middle and got lost.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there's a very distinct traits that these populations have that popped up and arose in just a few generations, right? Tens of generations. And so the conclusion of this paper is not just that these populations diverged quickly, which they did, but that this way of reproducing, or this way of divergence, right, finding new migration routes, could be a potentially widespread process that improves adaptive responses toward diverse ecological settings that migrants experience. So evolution of new migration routes could be a widespread thing, which means, if you're a creationist, again, put this right after the flood, you're releasing these migratory birds into this new world where they're finding new migration routes. Diversification can happen really, really quickly in that exact setting. And so we're seeing a remnant of that here because it's still happening. But if you took away all that, all the animals and humans, and the new migration route popped up because of human activity, actually. Humans were disrupting their migration routes. They found another migration route.
Right.
So if you take away all of those influences and you just have all you have is new land to colonize, every population is going to be finding its own migration route, and you're going to predict that this type of divergence would happen a lot in that setting. So that's one great example. Another one, this is covered by some creationists as well. I think ICR had a paper on this too. But cichlid fish in Lake Victoria basically were diverging pretty quickly because of essentially sexual selection, which is that females were choosing certain types of males. Basically, they diversify into different colors based on mating preferences. Mm-hmm. So they didn't give it. I read this whole article. They don't put anywhere in here how many generations it took or how many years it took. All they said was it happened quickly enough to be relevant to conservation planning. So if you're trying to make sure these species are thriving in Lake Victoria, this is something to keep in mind, is that they're diversifying into different types of fish pretty quickly. So basically what's happening here is there are fish that basically there's one gene that is present in some of these fish and not in the other. So that doesn't make it a new species. It's just one gene that, is even turned on or turned off. But some of these fish have what's called the long wavelength sensory opsin gene. And the fish that had this gene they could see certain colors that the other fish could not see. And then they were seeing these colors on other fish. And so you can see this diversification here. Fish that had this gene were they were reproducing with fish that were red, right? Because they could see that red color. Whereas the fish did not have that gene were reproducing more with the greenish bluish fish. And so they were splitting off into red and blue fish just based on selection of females. Or the selection of males by the female. And this was happening pretty quickly, and it was all happening. What's interesting about this one, it's all happening in the same space. There's no need to split, and these fish live over here, and these fish live over here.
Right.
This was a speciation event happening, or potentially a speciation event happening in one place, right? No geographic isolation, only reproductive isolation.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of interesting because usually they like them to split off into different groups.
Yeah, yep. So that's exactly right. So there's this kind of leads us to believe that there could be speciation events happening even when both new species, right, haven't split up yet. They're living together, right? That's just something that we should consider.
Yeah.
Is there could even be cases where divergence happens without isolating them.
Hmm.
So that's a fascinating example. Another one is this is one I'm going to do. I'm hoping to do more research on this, but in invasive species in particular. An invasive species is something that is a species that does not native to that area, but it's moving in from another place. And so we have a bunch of them. I think I think in Massachusetts here, somewhat upwards at 50% of our plant species are invasive. It's something crazy like that. So lots of species moving in that aren't supposed to be here and weren't here originally.
Hmm.
And so invasive species, what this paper found, they studied a bunch of different invasive species, and they found that invasive species can change their growth rate, meaning how fast they mature. They can change their dispersal ability. In other words, how much do they travel? Are they staying in one place or are they dispersing? And they can change their generation time. How long does it take for them to reproduce? All of these things they're not steady. They are actually factors that they can alternate or change depending on what the environment is that they're entering. So
Hmm.
these invasive species change all those things, and these changes can happen less than 10 years. So pretty immediate when they enter a new area. These factors are even evolving. You can even say the word that growth rate is evolving, dispersability is evolving, generation time, excuse me, is evolving.
Hmm.
And this is by the invasion of new land masses. So going back to the adaptive radiation idea, this is a new landmass. This invasive species is here. Sometimes, usually, they have no natural predators, and they're just spreading everywhere because it's a new landmass they can colonize. And one example I like to give of this one is the reason why some scientists think coyotes howl and wolves howl. It's been a mystery for a long time. One of their ideas is that coyotes will howl to let other coyotes know that they're around. And if a coyote hears a lot of other coyotes howling, it will reproduce less. So only, say, have one pup.
Hmm.
And it can kind of control that, which is amazing. It'll have one pup and raise one pup because it knows there's a lot of competition with other coyotes happening.
Mm.
Whereas if it howls and there's no howling around it, it thinks, well, there's not a lot of competition. All the rabbits are here for the taking. So I'll have 3 pups or 5 pups, and I can raise a group of pups and
Right.
then, fill that area. So that's exactly what we're looking for is their changing growth rate. They'll speed up their time to get sexually mature, and they'll disperse and move around a lot more. They can change all of those factors.
And of course, those kinds of adaptations are certainly in line with more of a intelligent design aspect, right? I mean, the wolf doesn't actually make decisions. It's not able to rationalize these things. So these things are built into it. It would make sense are built into it by a greater intelligence to help it adapt.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I say, yeah. It's not like the coyote is sitting down and saying, and maybe even talking with his mate and saying, well, how many pups should we have? Because I heard this many howls this week. They're obviously not making those calculated decisions. When we say that they do those things, we're kind of talking about how populations behave, right? And they're just kind of instinctively doing it because that's what helps them the most, right? That's what best has them adapted to the environment that they're in. So all of this leads to the development of what this paper calls invasive traits. So new traits even pop up sometimes because there's this population is spreading in this new area, and so this paper gives kind of a lot of examples of those, but it's an overview paper, right? Biodiversity review. It's reviewing all these examples. What's interesting here is I included this chart. This chart is not actually talking about the animals. It's talking about frequency of studies. And so they've collected all these different scientific papers, and they're finding that the most papers they find, which is right here, is the most papers and the second most papers and the third most papers. This is the timeline that these papers are finding for evolutionary change for length of time. So 1 to 50 years, it takes 1 to 50 years for evolutionary change of
Wow.
invasive traits.
Yeah.
This takes 51 to 100 years. This takes 101 to 150 years. So most of the papers that we have on this subject, a vast majority of them are between 1 and 150 years for the
Yeah.
population to evolve an invasive trait.
Yeah.
So, even just looking at that and thinking about it, you're thinking, well, it makes sense that we see that the most often because, we only live to be, to the top end of 100 years. We're not living to be 300 plus years to be able to observe that.
Right.
But we're looking at the rate of change, right? We're looking at the rate of change. And so the rate of change, for the most part, is pretty quickly that we're seeing. So it's a significant thing to include, even though, of course, we're not observing things for 300 plus years. And it does make sense to have most of the papers to be on this end. But
Yeah.
they clearly found that interesting enough to include it. And so I find that interesting enough to include as well.
Yeah.
So this is the same paper. By the way, this is from Diversity and Distributions, what the paper's called, 2008. They say, we review the recent literature and find that rapid evolutionary changes are common during invasions. These evolutionary changes include rapid adaptation of invaders to new environments, effects of hybridization, evolution in recipient communities. And then they say, strikingly, we document 38 species in which the specific traits commonly associated with invasive potential, which were the three I just said, have themselves undergone evolutionary change following introduction, in some cases over very short time scales, less than or equal to a decade. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're still on those. This is contemporary evolution time scales. There it is again. Rapid evolutionary change commonly occurs during species invasions. And then this is another interesting part of this is when invasive species move in, they are changing the landscape for the species that are already here. So I include here, this is a European starling. They were brought over to the States from, Europe intentionally, actually. I believe it was in the 1980s. Someone brought them over who really, really wanted all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays to be in North America as well. So every bird that was mentioned in Shakespeare, he brought a bunch of them over and released them in New York. This is something he wanted to do. And so now, thanks to him, we have European starlings everywhere. Everywhere. I have them outside my window every day. Okay, they're everywhere. Right. And so what happens is these populations, when they come in, it changes things so much that the native species that were here first evolve in response to those invaders. So they have to adapt to compete with these native species. And so we get something they're calling moving targets. So exotic species, meaning species that are moving in, they incite evolution in response to them that make these things, and they call them shifting canvases on which complex pictures of invasions and their consequences arise. So it's a back and forth. Invasive species does this, native species does this, invasive species comes right back at them. They're evolving kind of side by side. And again, I use the word evolving to just mean they're changing really quickly, which as a creationist, that's exactly what we'd expect to see. And so once again here, they're including this. If you're a conservationist, you really need to keep in mind that this is happening. So that if you're trying to save a native species, you need to understand how quickly things adapt back and forth in order to do that. All right, so I think this is my last one, I believe. This one is very interesting. So in this one, this is not something we observed in real time. So a little bit different from the other examples, but I'll tell you why I included it here as an example of contemporary evolution. But this one is a classic. This is the Galapagos tortoises. This paper says giant tortoises are not so slow. Rapid diversification and biogeographic consensus in the Galapagos. Basically, what's happening here is this paper is confirming what Darwin also observed, that we have different species, of tortoises on each of the Galapagos Islands in their own little ecosystem, their own little niche. All right, they're all living there, and there's just a bunch of them on these islands. And so these tortoises, they're saying, adapted to live on these islands, basically a lot of the same way that the Galapagos finches did. An ancestral tortoise landed on the island, started to diversify, and then that population spawned, a bunch of different other populations as they found new environments. And this is something called allopatric island speciation, which is they're separated from each other. All right, this is one population separated from the last one. They're in slightly different environments, so they become different species. Now, this island speciation occurs, according to this paper, along with something called the archipelago theory. So one of the mechanisms proposed by conventional scientists on how this happens, how speciation can happen quickly, is that a species actually evolves alongside the island that it lives on. So islands follow kind of a consistent life cycle where one of them pops out of the water, plants kind of cover it eventually, and then after the plants move in, some larger animals come in, like insects kind of fill in, and then other animals. And then as this island develops, both geologically and biologically, volcanic eruptions happen, all sorts of things happen. This is a life cycle of an island, and the species that lives on the island has to adapt alongside the changing conditions of the island. Mm-hmm. So this is called the archipelago theory.
Mm.
And so you can see here. Here's why I include this as contemporary evolution. So even though we do not observe these tortoises evolving in real time or producing new species in real time, and in fact, each of these islands, they're saying that this occurred in 1 to 2, maybe some cases 3 or 4 million years. Okay. Mm-hmm. They're giving you these millions of years. Well, I read this paper and they got those millions of years based on the conventional dates of the islands, not of the actual species themselves. So they are dating them according to how old the islands are. So in a creationist point of view, these islands are not millions of years old. These islands are hundreds or thousands of years old. So if you attach those dates on these islands, you have a lot of different tortoise species in only hundreds of thousands of years, which would put this, definitionally speaking, in that decades timeline of these species diverging from each other. So in order for you to get this many species in that amount of time, this has to be an example of contemporary evolution. They don't call it contemporary evolution because they're going off of the dates that they put on these islands.
Right.
So I'm kind of taking this paper and saying this is contemporary evolution according to creationists. They're not going to call it that, but if these islands are hundreds or thousands of years old, you absolutely need to call it that. So I did include that one. It's kind of a last minute inclusion, but I thought it was a good point. And this is one where you're actually described species differences, right? So no one's described that new species of European blackcap yet, right? They have different beaks and different sizes and everything, but we still have one species. We just have 2 different variations. This is an example where you have already described tortoise species that are objectively different that we have established already. So this is a great example. It's like a nice packaged example for creationists to point out and say, hey, if these islands aren't that old, then this is a real example of contemporary evolution producing a bunch of different species.
Right. Excellent point. The video that I did on finches, I did a video on finches, and in that video, they actually used the word speciation for hybridization of finches in just decades. So there's an example of an actual species occurring in real time. Would that be a good example to use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you made a great point in that video you're talking about that. If you say, so that one, you get a new species in about 50 years, I believe it was. If you take that timeline and you look at how many different finch species are there on the Galapagos Islands, and I think you made the point that fits a timeline of finches landing on that island and diversifying in the young Earth frame of mind much better. That rate, 50 years for a new species, that rate of change fits very well with a young Earth instead of the slow natural selection process that Darwin proposed. So yeah, that's a good point, and I think I even use that example of that new finch species. I actually used it in a different version of this exact presentation. I gave it at a conference that I hosted here in Massachusetts, the one Stephen Lloyd came out for, and I gave a similar presentation to this at that conference, and I included that, and I said hybridization is another way that it could happen. So I don't think there's one answer to our speciation question as creationists. I think there's a bunch of different answers. These migration routes we're looking at, colonizing islands that we're looking at, invasive species. We're finding a bunch of different potential answers that are all worth exploration, and hybridization is definitely one of those.
Yeah. Excellent. Just a couple of questions.
Sure.
So we've talked about mechanisms. A lot of the mechanisms that we've talked about are Darwinian, right? So they seem to fall within a Darwinian neo-Darwinian perspective. What kinds of other kinds of mechanisms could we possibly talk about that don't fit within a Darwinian perspective?
Sure. Yeah, so there are a bunch, a lot of them in the conventional literature, but I've kept an eye on a few. So there's one idea called the species begets species, or I'm sorry, diversity begets diversity hypothesis. I think I've seen it both ways, but it's more commonly, I believe, diversity begets diversity hypothesis. And that's the idea that the more species you have in an area, the faster speciation actually happens. So it's kind of that competition idea. So it basically says the more competition, the more different species you have, the faster species have to adapt to kind of live alongside other species. So if you're living with another species, say there's a lot of diagrams that are like this in popular textbooks, right? My zoology textbook back in college had a diagram of this. They have a big tree, and in that tree, like the top of the tree has one species living there, the middle of the tree has another species living there, and then along the bottom branches, other species of birds like to live there. So a bunch of different bird species living in different parts of the tree. So that can happen where if originally there was, one bird species there and another bird species comes in and this bird species starts eating all the pine cones that this other bird was looking for, well, then the bird that needs to eat those pine cones might adapt and will eat a different size pine cone or a different thing along will start adapting to eat something else. Maybe it starts eating insects that were on the tree instead. So this is kind of off the top of my head here, but basically if you throw more species together in the same area, they will find their own mini niche inside that environment, and will quickly adapt to that area. And so basically the equation is the more species you have, the more species you're going to get. And this could help again if animals are colonizing the world, they're diversifying. Well, it might even compound that if you get more and more species. Now you're going to get more and more species again because there's more competition, there's more diversification, there's more adaptations happening everywhere around you. So you're going to adapt, you're going to change as well to keep up with everyone else. So hopefully that made sense. But that's one idea.
Yeah, good. Yeah, there's. I think it's important just to keep that in mind that these different mechanisms, we're not exactly sure how we get all of this different rapid evolution. And we would hypothesize that as time goes on in areas of genetics and population biology, genetics as well, people are going to come up with more and more of these different mechanisms. The other thing is, like for the viewers out there that are watching this and they're thinking, wow, we've used the word evolution a lot. And, I grew up and I was told evolution was a lie. Evolution is wrong. And now they're thinking, hang on a minute, I thought you were a creationist. You're using evolution a lot. What do we say to those viewers out there who are creationists, but they really haven't come across these ideas before?
This is something that's come up a lot more recently. Again, now that I've taken this research and spreading around, I've encountered a lot of people asking similar questions. And you mean microevolution or macroevolution, or what do you mean? And again, my kind of response to that is that, and we hear this a lot, where evolution has so many definitions. You have to define your terms very carefully. And while that's true, I also think that evolution is often used commonly to just mean something very simple, which is change over time, right? Change over time, or change, even if you want to get more scientific, but still simple. You have the definition that is changes in allele frequencies over time, which is basically you have a population, and what if it changes the different genetic makeup of that population, right? So at first you had a lot of small beaks, and then eventually you have a lot of big beaks in your population. Nothing drastic has changed in that population. This isn't proving, we have common ancestors with chimpanzees and those finches, but that change in beak size is called evolution pretty commonly, right? So, and again, especially in that context of if you're just calling evolution change over time, again, according to our own model that we've made as creationists, we believe in way more change over a really short period of time compared to the evolutionists. So we were taught evolution is wrong, or evolution's a lie, because we mean it to say the extent of evolution, as in going from one cell to every living thing we have today. that type of evolution. While I'm not talking about that evolution, saying going from an ancestral pair of dogs to get, like I said earlier, the fennec fox, which has big ears and it's small and lives in the desert, to the maned wolf, which is a big lion's mane. Those are very different types of animals, even though we believe that they had a common ancestor, even as creationists. So that's a lot of change in a little bit of time, which is very consistent with all of our other arguments. Like, this is what I tell people is like, this isn't a weird thing. I have an article on the New Creation blog about this. Where I'm like, this isn't weird. When we see evidence of lots of erosion or lots of sedimentation, we say, look, that was a lot of erosion and a lot of sedimentation over a short amount of time, right? That's our response. Whereas the old Earth scientists will say, well, no, it's like a little sedimentation, a little erosion over a long period of time, right? Mm-hmm. I'm doing the same thing here. I'm saying, look, we have evidence of a lot of speciation because we have so many species. I'm going to say that's a lot of speciation or a lot of evolution in a short period of time instead of, slow evolution over a long period of time. It's like an exactly parallel argument to what we say about erosion, what we say about mutation rates, what we say about sedimentation, what we say about decay rates. When we talk about radiometric decay, we say, well, there's a lot of decay that happened. It just happened over a short period of time, right? So all of these arguments we use in creationism, it's the same argument as that. I'm just applying it to diversity. And I think we have to, because that's what our model suggests. The only tricky thing is the word evolution can mean so many different things.
Yeah. And that's important. I'm glad you brought that up. So it's important to note that, what we're not saying is that humans came from apes. What we're not saying is that, tetrapods came from fish, that everything came from a single cell. We're not saying that. We're saying that God used evolution or mediated design or rapid speciation or diversification or whatever you want to call it, in order for organisms to adapt in a fallen world, both after the fall and after the flood, and that all makes sense. I think that's important just for those viewers out there who might be thinking, oh, hang on a minute, you're talking about evolution. I've been taught that evolution's wrong. No, you got to be careful with your terms, and we want to do that. Are you done?
Oh yes. I was just about done.
Okay, sorry, my bad.
I think there's a little bit more. That's all right. There's a little bit more in here, but it's okay.
Keep going.
Yeah. So I guess with these tortoises, yeah. So really quickly here, I was about wrapping up, but one interesting thing on these tortoises is also that this is something I'm calling decreased dispersal ability. This paper, again, this is the one that I have in front of me. This is the one I've kind of carried around with me a lot for this research. Is that dispersal ability being changing? That's what I talked about with the coyotes. They can spread quickly or they can spread slowly. They can change that themselves depending on what they can do. Basically, what happens is once you get a different species on each island or a different population, let's say it's the same species, but you have a different population on each island. Well, once they have fully dispersed across everything they can disperse across, then whatever gene or whatever internal mechanism is pushing them to spread and reproduce and fill the area, they can pretty much turn that off pretty quickly and say, look, I found a spot where I live in very well, and I'm just going to stay right here. And so they actually decrease their dispersal ability pretty quickly to keep. So if I go back to this map, you get a different tortoise at each of these spots, right? Each of these triangles is a different tortoise population. Once they fit in that niche, there is no need for you to disperse any farther, right? Like, you are here, you are good, you are thriving, you have what you need, you're adapted to your environment. So your dispersal ability just kind of turns off or gets turned down dramatically to the point where you don't have to go anywhere because you're adapted here. And that's what helps this really become speciation, where before it was a population here, a population here. Now that they sit there, they fully adapt, they fully fit into their environment, and they don't disperse any further, and they really become that unique species that can probably hybridize with those that are around it, but they fit right there. So decreasing dispersal ability really is the cherry on top here that gets this from simple diversification to, hey, these are new species.
Right.
And so
that's really interesting that they do that.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a topic for a paper that I'm writing on teleology. The idea that organisms are designed for their particular environments, and that's what you see here. It's like it's built into the organism to fit into a particular niche, and then it turns off because it was designed that way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think they were even that paper that I cited there was also it was like simulating them. So you're using computer technology and basically telling their little organisms, their computer, ones and zeros, and they were telling their organisms to spread, and then they're trying to see, what would happen, and they were basically simulating speciation events. And that's what they found is that once one of their organisms found a spot that it fit, it just didn't move any farther, and it would stay there, and then that would like I said, that's the cherry on top. That's what makes it a new species is it's not just diversifying and spreading everywhere. It diversifies and spreads, and then once it finds that spot that it fits in, it becomes that species because it stays there and fully adapts, fully evolves to fit that environment. So, again, in summary, I think again there are two parts to my argument here. Based on this survey, based on just what exists in literature right now, there are two steps. One step is adaptive radiation, which is predictable. It has four causes, and it fits right in the post-flood world. Okay, so we would expect, even the secular scientists, conventional scientists would say, if the flood did happen, the immediate post-flood world would be a hotbed of diversification, speciation, all that. So adaptive radiations like that are predictable. They would fit the post-flood world exactly. And then the second part of my argument is today we see examples that are like remnants of what it was like back then. So the speciation would have happened really, really quickly back then, and it's slowed down a little bit, right? We've kind of everyone's filled their niche to some degree, but you still see evidence of rapid diversification happening today. And so between those examples and the potential for those examples to be widespread and occurring in a lot more places, between that and the adaptive radiation events that we talked about earlier, those two things, I think, make a very strong case for rapid speciation in the post-flood world, even if we don't exactly know what the mechanism is. And so I have future considerations here. Here are some things that could help for mechanisms. And then even one, when you asked earlier, what are some mechanisms? Another one, besides this, the diversity begets diversity. Another one I could mention is something called niche construction theory, which is that as an organism lives, it's modifying its own environment. And then its own environment, now that it's modified, actually applies different pressures onto that organism itself, which makes it adapt even more. So if an animal is moving around through thick forest, well, that forest is going to it's going to leave a trail for itself in that forest. And now that trail changes the way the organism lives because now it doesn't have to pave a new path. It's using the path that it had before. And so it's actually adapting to environments that it is making for itself. So beaver dams be a great example. Animals that use or interact with their own feces could be an example. So once you modify your environment, environment modifies you back, kind of. And there's even papers on like human niche construction theory. That is, we modify our environments. We kind of change in response to that as well as a species, right? Think of all the technology we have and how we are now different as a species because of our technology, because we've modified our own environment. So that's another example of a potential mechanism, but then there are some for consideration. And so with that, I mean, I think that basically covers this project, and my future is pursuing, I believe, my next research project will be diving more into the invasive species idea as its own model for post-flood speciation.
Yeah, I think this is super exciting because again, this paper I'm reading some articles from Darwin, and one of Darwin's critiques was creationism is a scientific dead end. I mean, if you believe, and of course back in his day, everyone believed in fixity of species, right? Where species were created, each species was created in its niche from the day of creation, and that's where they all were. And if you believed that at the time, then yes, biologically speaking, science is dead from a creationist perspective, right? And he said that was one of the reasons why he gave up. He gave up on fixity of species, but I mean, ultimately he gave up on biblical revelation. He believed that it was connected to that, and it wasn't. Fixity of species came from Aristotle. But anyway, I think what's interesting is he was very, very convinced that his research theory would be scientifically valid, but a creationist one wasn't. And that is true for creationism of the day, right?
Right.
It was a scientific dead end if you believed in fixity of species the way they did back in the 19th century. But this is exciting because we now, of course, don't believe in fixity of species, and now we have an actual a research area of research that we can actively pursue as creationists. And
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
exciting, right? So now all of a sudden, you've got all these possibilities of research that are open to you. And if only Darwin had known this back then, that you could be a creationist and yet have all of this research available to you, you know, I'm not saying he would have changed his mind, but it certainly would have made him
Yeah.
think, because back then that's not what they thought. So that's exciting.
Yeah, it would be interesting because he constructed his theory already believing, the world to be millions of years old. So, he read Charles Lyell's works
Right.
and was going about it as if they're millions of years. So if he recognized that the finches were actually populating the islands rapidly and it wouldn't take hundreds of thousands to millions of years, I wonder if he would go back and rethink kind of Lyell's position and say, hey, you're saying, that these layers take millions of years to form, that geology says the world is millions of years old. But it might not take that long to get the biodiversity that we have today. So
Yeah.
it's definitely worth thinking about. I was even reading the Origin of Species a little bit, just pieces of it yesterday on when he was talking about variations in domestic animals, and he was citing people who believed that all the different dog breeds and cat breeds were fixed, and that they didn't
Yeah,
come
that's
from
right.
common ancestors. Like, and they were saying they would argue that yes, they're domesticated. They change a little bit when they're domesticated, but they stay within that variation. And they believe that those dog breeds even lasted way back. And they were citing like ancient Egypt had these cat varieties and everything, and that they didn't come from wild species. They just came from older domesticated species, which is pretty remarkable. And he does a pretty good job dismantling that idea and
Here,
saying
yeah,
here's why these pigeons all had to come from this wild pigeon, and he does a very good job explaining that. But it's remarkable to think people have that mindset that even these small variations were always like that, right? They weren't a variation of something of a species before them. They are their own thing, which clearly doesn't fit with what we observe
right.
now.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how
Yeah,
his theory grew up in that particular scientific mindset, which is not where we're at now from a creationist perspective. And all creationists would reject fixity of species today. So, all right, well, Jake, look, hey, thanks very much. Really appreciate you coming on. It's been great. I'm sure we'll have lots of interesting comments as we publish it. So from me, that's about it from Creation Unfolding. Don't forget to pound the like button, to subscribe, ring the bell. Also, there is a link in the description if you'd like to give. I always appreciate that. And of course, pray. Even if you just spend a few seconds praying for Creation Unfolding Ministries, I'd appreciate that. Thank you and goodbye.